entitled "Neighbor Cut Down My Trees and Called Them an Eyesore on Their Property." Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside to breathe in the fresh air, only to be greeted by the worst kind of shock. My trees, my beloved trees, which I had poured years of love and care into, were gone. Chopped down. Just like that. No warning, no reason, just sawdust and stumps where once they stood proudly. It was like a part of me had been ripped away. You see, these weren't just any trees. I planted them with my father when I first moved into my home. Every spring I'd watch them grow taller, their branches stretching wide, providing shade on hot summer days. They weren't just trees, they were memories. They were a piece of my past, a gift from my dad, and a symbol of the hard work that went into making this house a home. So when I found them gone, it felt like my entire world had shifted. And what was even more infuriating? The reason behind it. My neighbor, this entitled, arrogant person, had decided they didn't like the trees. They called them an eyesore on their property. Can you believe that? After all this time, after all the care I put into them, someone else had the nerve to destroy them, just because they didn't like the view. If you find yourself getting angry just hearing this, trust me, I was in the same boat. If stories like this where justice is finally served, grab your attention, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss what happens next. Let's dive in. When I first moved into this neighborhood, it felt like the perfect place to settle down. Quiet, peaceful, people were friendly, or at least they seemed to be at first. Everyone pretty much kept to themselves, but there was this unspoken sense of community. Neighbors would wave when they saw each other, and every now and then someone would host a little get-together. It was the kind of place where you felt comfortable, where you didn't expect drama. But of course, that's not how things always turn out, is it? Enter him. My neighbor, let's call him Mark. Mark had just moved in a year before I did. At first, he seemed like the kind of guy who'd just keep to himself. But soon, I started noticing something about him. He was always complaining about everything. His lawn wasn't green enough. The kids across the street were too noisy. The streetlights were too bright. He would find something, no matter how small, to make a big deal out of. But I never thought he'd go this far. I mean, sure, he was a little demanding, but who would have guessed he had this kind of entitlement hidden under that "I'm just being helpful" sod? And then, there were my trees. Those trees weren't just random plants in my yard. They were a part of the property, and they had a purpose. They formed the boundary between my yard and Mark's. To me, they represented more than just a line in the dirt. They were living, breathing symbols of how much I cared about my home. They shaded my garden in the summer, kept the wind at bay in the winter, and helped the environment in ways most people didn't think about, absorbing carbon, providing shelter for birds, and just making everything feel more serene. But to Mark, they were nothing more than an eyesore. He couldn't stand the fact that they blocked his view of the street from his living room window. It didn't matter that they were planted right where they belonged, on my side of the property. It didn't matter that they were just as much a part of the landscape as anything else. All he saw was an inconvenience to his perfect little world. And that's when things started to go downhill. At first, I didn't think much of it. Mark would occasionally make little comments when we crossed paths, usually when we were both outside tending to our lawns. Things like, "Those trees really block the view, don't they?" Or, "I can't see the street from my living room because of them." He would say it with a smile, like he was just making casual conversation, but I could tell there was something behind his words. His tone wasn't exactly friendly. It was more like he was trying to plant the seed that maybe these trees weren't as welcome as I thought they were. I didn't think much of it at first. I was just trying to be polite, trying to be a good neighbor. So I'd respond with something like, "Well, they're right on the property line. They've been there for years." I'd even mention how the trees weren't just some random plants I'd put there. They were a part of the landscape, part of what made the yard feel like home. But Mark wouldn't drop it. He kept going on and on about how they were ugly and how they made his house look cluttered. I'd smile and nod, trying to stay calm, even though I could feel the tension building between us. He wasn't just complaining, he was demanding something change. I explained again, politely, that the trees were well within my rights to keep. They were planted on my side of the line, and I wasn't going to uproot them just because they didn't fit his perfect picture of what he thought the neighborhood should look like. Then, one afternoon, I came home from work early. As I turned onto my street, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The trees, the ones that had stood tall and proud for years, were gone. I couldn't believe it at first. It was like something out of a nightmare. I parked my car and rushed up to my yard, my heart sinking in my chest with every step. What I saw when I turned the corner nearly knocked the wind out of me. The trees, my trees, were chopped down to nothing but stumps. All around me was the mess of broken branches and sawdust, the sharp smell of fresh wood cut cleanly through the air. It felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My eyes kept searching the ground, trying to find some shred of hope, some part of the trees that still remained. But no, nothing. They were just gone. I stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. A cold sweat broke out across my back as the reality hit me. I looked over at Mark's house. His blinds were pulled back, and there he was, sitting in his living room, staring directly at the spot where my trees had once been. The realization hit me hard. He did this. He actually did it. He'd cut down my trees, and he didn't even have the decency to come talk to me about it first. I wanted to scream, to march over there and demand answers, but I had to stay calm. This wasn't just about the trees. This was about someone crossing a line they had no right to cross. My legs felt like jelly as I stood there in the middle of my yard, staring at what was once a beautiful line of trees that I had nurtured for years. It was like being hit by a wave of disbelief, and then a crushing weight of heartbreak. All those years I'd spent planting, watering, and watching them grow, gone in a matter of hours. It wasn't just the trees that had been destroyed. It was the memories, the time, the care, all of it reduced to a pile of broken branches and sawdust. I felt numb. There was a pit in my stomach, like all the air had been sucked out of the world. I couldn't take my eyes off the stumps, which were the only remnants of what had once stood proudly in my yard. I had a knot in my throat, and every breath I took felt heavy. It wasn't just the physical loss, it was the feeling of betrayal. How could someone take something so personal away from me? And how could they do it so coldly, without a single word or warning? I don't know what made me walk over to Mark's house, but I found myself standing at his front door, fists clenched at my sides. I needed answers. I needed to understand how he could do something like this. He'd crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let it slide. I rang the doorbell, and within seconds Mark appeared, his smug expression immediately setting my nerves on edge. It was like he'd been expecting me. Well, he said, almost casually, leaning against the doorframe. I see you've noticed. I was so furious I could barely speak. You cut down my trees? I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. You had no right to do that. Those were mine. Mark shrugged as if I was making a fuss over nothing. Oh, come on. They were an eyesore and everyone knows it. They were blocking my view, and honestly, they were just ugly. I'm doing the neighborhood a favor by getting rid of them. My mouth went dry as I tried to process what he was saying. Ugly? An eyesore? These were the trees I planted with my father. They weren't just there to block his view. They were a part of my home, my life. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, even though every inch of me wanted to lash out. You don't get to decide what's ugly on my property, I finally managed to say. Those trees were on my land. You had no right to take them down. Mark just shook his head, as if he didn't care about my words at all. Look, they were ruining the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Now it looks better, cleaner. I'm sure the whole block will be relieved. I'm just helping out. Helping out? I could feel my blood boiling. You didn't even have the decency to ask me first, or at least talk to me about it. You just destroyed something I cared about, and you think that's okay? He gave a small, smug smile, almost like he was proud of himself. I'm just saying, the neighborhood will thank me. The place looks a lot better without them, trust me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like he didn't even care about how much that act had hurt me. To him, it was just a way to improve his view and pat himself on the back for doing the right thing. But to me, it was a violation. It wasn't just about the trees anymore. It was about respect, or rather, the lack of it. Mark didn't understand that. Or worse, he didn't care. All I could do was stand there, shaking with anger, my mind racing for a way to fix this. But in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't going to be something I could just let slide. I stood there, staring at Mark's house, my mind racing as I tried to process everything that had just happened. I couldn't let this slide. Not after everything. But where do you even begin when someone destroys something so important to you? The anger, the hurt, it was all still bubbling up inside me, but now it was turning into something else. It was turning into determination. I had to do something about this. I wasn't going to let Mark get away with it. The first thing I did was start taking photos. I wasn't sure exactly what I needed, but I knew I had to document everything. The stumps, the broken branches scattered across my yard, the mess Mark had left behind. It all had to be recorded. I took photos from every angle, zooming in on the jagged edges of the stumps, the sawdust still on the ground like a fresh wound. I even recorded a short video, speaking directly to the camera, describing what had happened and how it had affected me. The more I did, the more I realized how serious this was. Mark hadn't just cut down my trees, he'd violated my property, and I wasn't going to let that go unnoticed. Next, I thought about the property records. I needed to make sure I had a solid foundation for everything. I went inside and pulled out the deed to my house, flipping through the pages until I found the details about the boundaries. Sure enough, those trees were planted well within my property line. There was no question. Mark had no legal right to touch them, let alone destroy them. That gave me a small sense of relief, knowing that I was in the right. But it wasn't enough just to know it. I needed to make sure Mark knew it too. I went down to the local council office next. I had a feeling Mark wasn't going to back down easily, and I wanted to know exactly what my options were. After waiting for what felt like an eternity, I was able to speak with someone who walked me through the process of filing a complaint. The more she spoke, the angrier I got. Apparently, cutting down trees without permission, especially ones that were part of the local ecosystem, was a big deal. There were regulations in place for a reason, and Mark had ignored every single one of them. The woman told me I could either file a formal complaint or hire a lawyer to press charges, depending on how far I wanted to take this. I knew I wasn't ready to go that far just yet, but it felt good knowing I had options. I wasn't helpless in this situation. I had the law on my side. As I walked out of the office, I felt the weight of what I was about to do settle on my shoulders. Mark thought he could just take what he wanted and get away with it, but I was done letting him walk all over me. He might have thought his little improvement was harmless, but it was a violation, and I was going to make sure he paid for it. I was still trying to wrap my head around how arrogant he was, as if cutting down the trees made him some kind of hero, fixing the neighborhood's ugliness. But I knew what he didn't realize. He was about to face the consequences of his actions. I could already picture the smug look on his face when I showed him the evidence I'd gathered. He probably thought he could just smile and shrug it off. He probably assumed that, because he'd gotten away with things like this in the past, he would this time too. But I wasn't going to let that happen. This wasn't just about trees. It was about setting a precedent. Mark needed to know that he couldn't just do whatever he wanted without any repercussions. And with each step I took toward holding him accountable, I could feel the tension in the air. Mark might have thought he'd won, but I was ready to take this as far as I had to. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not this time. The process of resolving this whole mess wasn't quick. Every day felt like a countdown to something I couldn't quite control. The anger that had started this journey hadn't faded. It had only grown, becoming more focused as I worked through the steps I needed to take. But each step I took felt like a battle, a fight against someone who didn't care about anyone but himself. I had the evidence, the documents, and the legal backing, but nothing was guaranteed. I knew that. It wasn't until the official inspection that I felt the first rush of hope. The council sent out an official inspector after I filed my complaint. He came with a clipboard, took notes, and asked a few questions, mostly about the trees, the property line, and how I found out what had happened. He seemed to take me seriously, which meant a lot. Mark was a smooth talker, but I had the facts on my side. The inspector walked around the yard, glancing at the stumps and the remaining debris. "It's clear," he said, his voice neutral. "The trees were yours, and cutting them down was a violation of local property laws." I felt a sense of relief flood through me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't just overreacting. The law was on my side, and someone official had confirmed it. Still, that wasn't the end of it. There would be hearings, paperwork, and potentially court dates before anything would really happen. But in that moment, I allowed myself a small smile. This was one step closer to making things right. The court hearing was scheduled about a month later. I didn't expect things to move quickly, but I knew I had to be prepared. I showed up with my evidence, the photos, the video, the property records. I even had a few neighbors who were willing to testify about Mark's behavior in the past. They didn't like him either. It felt like the entire neighborhood had been watching, hoping someone would finally stand up to him. Mark, on the other hand, showed up with his usual smug grin, like this was all just some minor inconvenience. He had a lawyer with him, someone who probably thought they could talk their way out of anything. But it didn't work that way. Not this time. The judge listened to both sides, and you could tell from the look on their face that they weren't impressed by Mark's excuses. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. I told the judge everything about how the trees weren't just property to me, but part of my life, my memories. I explained how Mark didn't care about any of that, how he'd acted like he was above the law, destroying something without any regard for the damage he was causing. When the verdict came down, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. It was like waiting for a storm to hit, but with every second, I felt more sure of what was coming. Mark was found guilty of property destruction. The judge made it clear that he had no right to destroy something that wasn't his, and that his actions were not just disrespectful, they were illegal. The penalty was almost more than I expected. The judge ruled that Mark had to pay restitution, an amount that would cover the cost of the trees plus damages. But it didn't end there. He was also ordered to replace the trees with specific types of trees to match what had been there before. And if he failed to do either of those things, there would be additional fines, and even the possibility of jail time for repeated violations. Mark's face drained of color as the judge spoke, and for once I saw him look truly rattled. It felt surreal, hearing those words, knowing that the law had sided with me. But the sense of justice was overwhelming. I wasn't just getting compensation for what had been taken from me. I was getting the satisfaction of seeing Mark face consequences for his arrogance, his sense of entitlement. For once, he wouldn't be able to get away with it. As the court session came to a close, I walked out of the room feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The weight of the situation wasn't fully gone, but the victory tasted sweet. Mark wasn't going to just get away with hurting me. He was going to have to live with the consequences of his actions. And that was the turning point, the moment when everything started to feel right again. As the dust settled, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The anger, the frustration, the fight for justice, and the lessons I had learned along the way. The whole experience had been eye-opening in more ways than one. First and foremost, I learned how important it is to stand up for yourself, especially when it comes to your rights. I could have let the situation slide. I could have tried to brush it off and keep the peace. But in the end, standing my ground not only helped me get what I deserved, but it also gave me a sense of power I hadn't known I needed. It was a reminder that if you don't speak up when something matters to you, no one else will. I also came to realize just how important it is to document everything. Without the photos, the videos, the legal records, and even the support of my neighbors, I wouldn't have had the proof I needed to back up my claims. Mark had his arrogance, his ability to twist the truth, but I had the truth on my side. I couldn't have won this without evidence. And that's a lesson I'll never forget. It wasn't just about getting what was rightfully mine back. It was about proving that entitlement doesn't win in the end. The truth, with enough backing, always comes out. The aftermath of the case also changed something in the neighborhood. People started to pay more attention to boundaries, to respect what was theirs and what belonged to others. I noticed that the little disputes that used to arise, someone's tree hanging over someone else's fence, or a fence that was a little too close to the line, seemed to be handled with more care now. No one wanted to be caught in a similar situation, and I think a lot of my neighbors were silently grateful that someone had finally stood up to Mark. The whole thing left an imprint on the community, and for once, the tension in the air didn't feel so thick. That being said, there were still some underlying tensions. Mark wasn't one to just let things go, and I could see the way he stared at me sometimes when we crossed paths. His pride had taken a major hit, and even though he was technically following the court's orders now, he wasn't exactly thrilled about it. There were whispers here and there, people talking about the way the case played out and how things had shifted. Some people were on my side, of course, but others weren't so sure. They didn't like the idea of having to choose sides. Still, it was clear that the dynamic in the neighborhood had changed. People were more cautious, more aware that sometimes standing up for what's right could make a big difference. As for me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The trees, those beautiful towering symbols of everything I had worked hard for, weren't just gone, they were replaced, and I had made sure that the same thing wouldn't happen again. More than that, I had sent a message, not just to Mark, but to everyone in the neighborhood. Entitlement doesn't win, justice does. Looking back, I realize how much this experience reshaped me. I learned the power of persistence, the value of standing firm, and how to make sure my voice was heard, no matter how small the issue seemed. I didn't just reclaim my trees, I reclaimed my peace of mind. And that, I think, was the most important part of all. As I sit here reflecting on everything that's happened, one thing stands out to me above all else. Justice was served. In the end, the truth won out, and the neighbor, who thought they could just bulldoze through my rights, had to face the consequences of their actions. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how entitled someone might feel, they can't escape the repercussions of what they do. I'm also grateful for the support I received throughout the whole ordeal, from the neighbors who stood by me to the legal professionals who helped me fight this battle. There's a certain satisfaction in seeing someone held accountable, especially when they thought they could get away with it. I know this wasn't just about trees, it was about standing up for what's right. And as much as I wish this had never happened, I can't deny the sense of pride I feel knowing I did the right thing. So let this be a reminder to anyone facing a similar situation. Don't let people walk all over you. Stand your ground, take action, and trust that justice, in the end, will find its way. So, let me ask you, what would you do if a neighbor tried to destroy something you've worked so hard for, something you truly care about? I'd love to hear your thoughts and how you'd handle a situation like this. Drop your comments below, and let's talk about it. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more captivating tales of entitlement, justice, and people who think they can get away with anything, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching.